Martin Scorsese is widely regarded as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time and has some incredible films. I do think that people don't realize that he has made some not great films, especially ones that I am not personally a big fan of, but I do think the fact that he has made so many great movies kind of balances that out and gets people to realize how great of a filmmaker he actually is. So his work always has intrigued me, and up until not long ago I hadn't seen any of his films, so I decided to binge every one of his movies, all 25 of the ones that he directed alone, so I will not be including New York Stories, and I'm going to be ranking them from the worst to the best, so let's get right into it. Boxcar Bertha is one of those films that it's not really even like a so bad it's good or just the worst is actually decent. It's just a bad film in my opinion. The protagonist, obviously Bertha, is not very likable. The plot is kinda all over the place, and while there is some cool camera work being done here, obviously by Scorsese, there's clear ambition and technical prowess from the director himself, but as a story it doesn't work very coherently, and overall is just a not very good film that I didn't have a good time with and definitely won't be watching again. As much as I hate to say this as an excuse, The Age of Innocence just really was not my thing. I'm not a big fan of period piece dramas, and this is a very bland and basic and boring period piece drama. As with every one of his other films, I will be saying this, that there is clear ambition and technical prowess in all of his films. Martin Scorsese always has something cool going on with the camera or with the editing, but the performances cannot carry this film, and neither can the technical aspects, because the story is just not something that invested me in the slightest. And in a film where I'm kind of just feeling nothing, it's hard for me to get invested, and not to mention it is actually a pretty decently long movie, and so it kind of overstays its welcome, and that's why I really just did not like the film. So Gangs of New York was a little disappointing, but also kind of expected. Since I typically have pretty similar opinions to Karsten Rundquist, I figured that I wouldn't like this one very much, but there were a lot of people that said this is a really good film, so I didn't really know how to feel with it, and I was not a big fan. In my opinion, even the Leonardo DiCaprio performance was not great. It was okay. I think the best performance in this film by far was Daniel Day-Lewis, who I think actually gives a phenomenal performance. But the color palette is really gross. It's kind of brown and dark and gloomy, which I was not a big fan of. While it kind of does portray the time period pretty well, I just was not a fan. As with almost all of his films, there is some really cool stuff going on with the camera, but a lot of the stuff in this film just didn't work. And overall, like as an entire experience, it really bored me. I stopped this film like halfway through my first watch. I couldn't even get through it. And then when I finally forced myself to sit down and watch the entire film, I was extremely disappointed and let down, and I was really bored basically the entire film. New York is one that basically no one talks about, and I think it had a lot of potential, but it was dragged out for way too long. That is the problem that I have with a lot of Scorsese movies, because most of his movies are very long films, and I don't know if it's just me, but I think long films are either a really hit or miss. If you get a good story, good characters, and make sure that no time is wasted, I think long movies can be better than short movies. But if you don't get everything right, then long movies are way worse than bad short films. Or not short films, but like movies with short run times. However, New York had the concept, it had the talent, but the characters and the length of the film just really were not investing. This is basically La La Land, except before La La Land, and it had obviously a legendary director directing the film, had some great technical aspects, great performance from Robert De Niro, but the characters are not very likable, not very fleshed out, and they take way too much time in this film. And considering that they have this much time, the characters are not fleshed out, the story is not fleshed out, and you really just don't care for these people. So overall, it was not a disappointing film per se, but one that I think could have had a way higher spot on this list if it was executed very well. The Aviator is a film that not a lot of people talk about anymore, and I kinda understand it because basically as soon as this film was over, I kinda forgot about it. It has a decently memorable Leonardo DiCaprio performance, but what really threw me off the most about this film was the color grading, because it really just looked like some third grader slapped on some random filter on an editing software and they kinda just went with it. Because the reds were like really saturated, but everything else looked like really desaturated, and it looked really wonky, and it really threw my experience off with the film. But not only was there really weird color grading, I think most of the performances were not all that memorable. Even Leo's performance was good, but not great as most of his are. And overall, as a story, it could have been way better. I think it had extreme potential. The actual story and plot of the film is really intriguing to me, and especially since it has to do with filmmaking, it is something that interested me, but they really kind of butchered the execution with it, and overall they spent way too much time on stuff that I did not care about, and so overall this was a pretty disappointing film, to be honest. So here is when the really controversial opinions start coming in. You know, Gangs of New York and The Aviator are liked films, but I don't think anyone's going to get too mad with those being near the bottom, because most people that like those films can understand why people don't like them. But Casino was one that I thought I was going to like. First like 15-20 minutes of the film, really great. It introduced all of our characters and it brought us to the Las Vegas, obviously the world of casinos. I think the set design was absolutely incredible. I loved obviously the casinos and Las Vegas. Robert De Niro was giving a great performance for basically even the entire film. I think overall he did give a good performance, but there are some things that really threw me off. One of which, again, I will say, is the length of the film. I think it is way too long. It spends way too much time in the second act and stuff that I really don't care about. I think when they were introducing Ginger, I know a lot of people love the song they used, but I think it felt like really abrupt and kind of like not integrated properly. Ginger as a character was not super likable in my opinion. I didn't love her. She was like okay. But my biggest issue, as I said, was with the pacing of this film. I felt like I was basically done the movie, but it turns out I wasn't even halfway through one time. And this was just an absolute snooze fest. This felt like it took like 7 hours to get through or something. It was really long. And I was just not invested in these characters at all. They had no reason for me to be invested in their life and in their success. So when they didn't succeed, I didn't care because I really had no reason to root for these people. So I think Casino is a film, again, that had really great potential, but it really just got butchered and ruined by some really bad fleshing out of the characters, and just a film that is dragged out for way too long. The Color of Money is a pretty fun film starring Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. It is a very good cast, it has a really cool premise, and I think overall this is exactly what I was expecting from the film, you know? There were some things that actually surprised me. The pool scenes were surprisingly well shot and well edited. It was really immersive. I honestly was invested in the story the entire time, although I wasn't necessarily invested in like the characters. I think they were definitely well written and provided what they needed to provide for the story. I wanted to see Fast Eddie succeed because I did like him as a character. Tom Cruise's character, however, I didn't like so much, but that's a whole different story. I think the pool scenes, as I said, are very cool in this film, and the pacing is really good. This is a film that isn't really that long. It's not even 2 hours long, and it's, again, as I said, this film doesn't necessarily get everything right, but it's not quite 2 hours, so it doesn't need to get everything right, and I was invested the entire time regardless. And overall, this was just a really fun movie that I had a really good time with, but there just were better films in this filmography in my opinion. No, this is not a prank. I really was let down by Goodfellas, and I think it is arguably the most overrated film ever made. Although I don't hate the movie at all, I just think it is incredibly overrated. I don't see how people can say it's a masterpiece. I think objectively it is a well-made film. I don't think it is one of the best films of all time at all, and I want to give you guys a concrete argument of why I don't like this film, and maybe that'll prevent you from leaving a dislike. Probably not, but I'll give it anyway. So basically, this film is filled with antagonists because they really all have unlikable qualities, and they're doing stuff that I could not really get behind. And, you know, as a whole, I didn't really like any of the characters. I will obviously say that the story and plot is obviously told with immense skill from Martin Scorsese, because Scorsese is a super talented filmmaker. But I think the story is kind of just butchered. I didn't really care for any of the characters. I just need a protagonist to root for in a story, because if I don't have anyone I can root for, then I'm not emotionally invested in the story. And this is exactly what happened with Goodfellas. When I was watching it, I felt like dead and like lifeless. I felt like I was watching a movie and not immersed in the experience whatsoever. And the way our hero is kind of written, obviously Henry Hill, is he really doesn't have any redeeming features. And honestly, I think Ray Liotta gives the weakest performance of all of the main characters. I think Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci gave better performances. And so overall, this is a film that really does not resonate with me, although I can appreciate the technical prowess of it for the most part. I think it is incredibly overrated, and it has some really unlikable characters, and just overall a story that I can never get invested into, and makes me feel dull and lifeless while watching the movie. I kinda loved this movie. I don't really know why. This feels like Scorsese just learning how to make a movie, and there's something just really charming about that, and I'm not really even sure why. I just love to see Scorsese in a more stripped down, raw stage of his career, and seeing some raw, untamed, kinda not amazing performances. It really was charming. The story was, you know, it was good enough to have me invested in these characters' lives and emotionally invested and whatnot. And I think there were some good performances, and overall it's a really simple film that is a early indication of Scorsese's style and all that sort of stuff. And it's overall just a really charming little film that is definitely one of the shortest in his filmography, which definitely gets brownie points for that. But yeah, I think this is a really underrated film, to be honest, even though it's his first, and it's just a really charming, fun experience that kind of just shows Scorsese learning how to make a film. Cape Fear was absolutely wild. Robert De Niro gives a really great performance as Max Cady. It was, oh my god, like I can't say that much about this film other than it was absolutely crazy. I don't want to say anything that I don't have to say about this film, because it's best to go into this film knowing nothing, which is exactly what I did, and I really liked the movie. You know, great performances around the board, even with supporting actors. This is a film that, again, is not super long. It's a little tiny bit over 2 hours in length, and I think not a minute is wasted in this film developing characters and story, and it really had me invested in the film, and it honestly was pretty creepy at times, which I think really worked for me. And this is a film that I think is pretty overlooked by a lot of people, because it's not one of Scorsese's more popular films, but I honestly really liked it, and I recommend you check it out and go in as blind as possible. Kundan is another extremely underrated film. I think by far this is Scorsese having the most fun making a movie. Although it's not necessarily his most fun movie, it's very clear with the camera work and the editing that he was just having a fun time experimenting with this film, and I think the experimentalism really worked with this film. There is some really cool experimental cinematography and some cool edits that I've never seen in any of his films before, and it 100% worked. The story was honestly pretty cool. It had me invested in these characters, and it was just a really cool, unique experience that was made even cooler because it was based on a real event that happened with the 4-year-old Dalai Lama, or however you pronounce it. I'm not really sure. I'm sorry if I butchered that. But yeah, Kundan was a really charming and entertaining experience. Again, another theme with these films as we go up the list. Not a super long movie, but yeah, it is definitely one of Scorsese's more underrated films, and if you're looking for Scorsese having fun making a movie and trying some new things, this is definitely a film that I think you'll like. Shutter Island is a pretty great psychological thriller, which I love it for because it is something very different from what Scorsese usually does. Leonardo DiCaprio gives a phenomenal performance in this film, as well as Mark Ruffalo, and it was honestly a very creepy and unsettling film, and it really worked in that way. I think when I watched it, I didn't necessarily it didn't click with me that this was made by Martin Scorsese because it doesn't have a lot of his signature style. But when you go back, I've rewatched this film since, and I can definitely tell now that it was made by Scorsese based on the technical prowess of the film alone. Has some great cinematography, has some of his signature whip pans and stuff like that, and some cool editing that makes you really nervous and kind of on the edge of your seat the entire time. And it's honestly really crazy and really unsettling. Again, this is another one that I think you should go into the film knowing as little as possible. Even though I did know the twist going into this film, it honestly didn't change it whatsoever, but I think it might even hit harder if you don't know what the twist is. So go into this one blind as well, and it is just a really creepy, fun experience, and just a really well-made movie. Hugo was a film that I was not really expecting to like very much, and I really did. I think the two different storylines interwoven definitely had some parts where it felt kind of jaggedy and jittery. I don't really know what word to use, but it didn't feel seamless and smooth. But I think for the most part it did work very well. My favorite storyline was the one with Georges Méliès and the kind of filmmaking side of things with that story. That was definitely my favorite storyline. It really worked for me. And even Hugo kind of learning about his father and all that sort of stuff, that was the other storyline, and I still really liked it. I think what brought this film down more from my very first review about this film was I realized that the acting wasn't necessarily all that great from especially the child actors. They were okay in the movie, but not great. And overall, I think this was a really good film. Again, this is another film that Scorsese just looked like he was having fun making the film because he used some pretty experimental stuff in the mix. But yeah, it's just a really fun, wondrous experience where I haven't felt a sense of wonder in a film like this, especially this much, in a long time. And it really just made me feel good. So this is definitely a feel-good film, and I would honestly watch this film again. Bringing Out the Dead was a gross film, but I think that was the point. It stars Nick Cage as a New York City paramedic, and it is honestly way better than I thought it was going to be. It is dark, grimy, and gross, makes me feel like I haven't slept in 5 days, but I think that's kind of the point, and I kind of loved it for that. I don't usually like being super disturbed by a film, but this felt like it was necessary. Everything into this film is packed into a really concise runtime. Everything is fleshed out and worked out perfectly, honestly, in the runtime that they have. Nick Cage is the perfect man for this role, and I think he absolutely killed it. And overall, the plot of the film is honestly pretty interesting, and the filmmaking techniques and the story and kind of how everything looks and made you feel, The fact that this film made me feel like I hadn't slept in 5 days was definitely an achievement, and I think that's exactly what it was trying to do, and it definitely works in that way. Raging Bull is a film that definitely grew on me over time. When I first came out of it, I thought it was a pretty average film that didn't really hit hard with me, but as I've had more time to sit and think about this movie, it definitely resonates with me more. I think Robert De Niro gives one of his more unique performances in this film, definitely a really great performance, and it's just such a good movie. It is definitely Scorsese's best shot film. Well, maybe not definitely, but I'd say between this and Silence are probably his two best shot films. The black and white cinematography really works in this film. For some reason, I couldn't really put my finger on why, but I think it definitely did. I don't know how this film would fare in color, but this is one of the things I can't explain. And overall, the kind of themes of rage and masculinity really hit hard with me as I thought about this film more. And it's not necessarily a film I think is deserving of the masterpiece title it is so often given, but it is definitely a great film. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore was possibly the most pleasantly surprising film on this entire list. It is the only Scorsese film with a female protagonist, and I think it really works. It doesn't necessarily feel like a Scorsese film, and it doesn't really feel like it's necessarily trying to achieve too much, and I think for that, it really works. A lot of Scorsese's films, I feel like, are trying to be bigger than they should be, or trying to be bigger than they actually are, and this film is trying to be a small, quaint little film about a woman and her son, and honestly, it just really works, really heartfelt, really emotional, and it just feels like something that Scorsese has never achieved before. This is maybe his most unique film, and it feels like something, as I said, that he's never achieved before, that he's never tried to achieve before, and when he tries to achieve it, he gets it. And I think this film is really well shot, really well edited, as with basically all of his other films, and the acting performance, specifically Ellen Burstyn in the lead role, was really great. And I think overall, as I said, it achieves something that is really special in this man's filmography, and for that reason, I think it deserves a spot high up on this list. The Last Temptation of Christ was a film I, for some reason, was not expecting to love that much, but it really worked with me. The film was nearly 3 hours long, but it felt like it went by way faster, and everything to do with the camera, the score, and the performance from Willem Dafoe, which by the way is absolutely amazing, just works perfectly, all to the master controlling the strings, who is obviously Martin Scorsese. This film is simultaneously beautiful and extremely hard to watch in some instances. There's some really disturbing stuff that made my stomach churn, but also some insanely beautiful shots and atmosphere and sets. This doesn't attempt to look at Jesus in the light that most see him in and most religious films try to paint him in, but it kind of attempts to understand him, portraying him as like a normal human being. It provokes thoughts and questions of the deeper meaning of religion and worship having to do with anything, not just necessarily religion. I truly think I found a deeper meaning to this film that was meant to be found, and I'm really happy I did, because this is a really extraordinary film that a lot of people dislike, but I think it worked really well. Mean Streets was a really pleasant surprise. This was very early on in his filmography, and early on he had some really bad films, I think, so I was worried about the trajectory of where his films were going, but Mean Streets got him right back on track. I think once Scorsese got to his bread and butter, which is his New York City gangster films, he definitely succeeded. This is such a phenomenal portrayal of New York City, in my opinion the best of his filmography, and I was so immersed into the time period and location due to the amazing cinematography and lighting in the film. I felt like I was in the movie, and I don't typically get that experience very often. Harvey Keitel was incredible and even had a better performance than Robert De Niro, who also gave a great performance. I really did love this film, even though it felt a little unfocused and a little rushed at times, and I just think it worked really well. A lot of people don't like how it is, and it feels like it's kind of dragged out and unfocused, which I think it is personally a little unfocused, but it kind of felt like the point. But you know, overall I think this was a film that was really great, had some great performances, really masculine raw energy, and it really kind of moved along, and the pacing was unlike anything I've ever seen in a film before, and honestly it was really great in that sense. Taxi Driver is another film that a lot of people consider to be one of Scorsese's masterpieces, and I honestly thought it was a great film. This was really good, but definitely by no means a masterpiece, but it's pretty freaking great. Robert De Niro gives a great performance as always, and although not as good as Mean Streets did, it was a great portrayal of New York City. The plot was interesting enough, but it was definitely my biggest flaw with the movie. It would have been interesting if it wasn't all over the place. The political plotline felt really unmotivated and like it really didn't need to be there, and other parts felt pretty dragged and a little boring, but they were necessary for Travis's motivation. Overall, still a great film, but it definitely is not without its flaws, but definitely still one of Scorsese's better films. The Departed was honestly one of the earlier Scorsese films I watched. I watched them in release order, but The Departed was one that I really wanted to watch, so I actually watched it earlier on than I needed to, and let me say it was great. Every performance in this film was spot on, and dare I say almost perfect. Jack Nicholson was incredibly intimidating, and Matt Damon and Leonardo DiCaprio give some amazing performances and delivered emotion when it seemed like it was needed. The whole premise of this film seemed interesting even before my watch. I was invested before I even hit play, but once I hit play, I could not take my eyes off the screen. This was one of, if not the most immersive and enthralling film I've seen in a long time. It built tension like you would not believe, and it gets you invested in every single character. The Departed is unlike any cinematic experience I've had in a long time, and the third act was one of the most tense and amazing final acts I've ever seen. Overall, it was an incredible experience, definitely one of Scorsese's best films, and overall a film that I think has really great rewatch value, and I cannot wait to revisit in the future. This is really freaking weird. If you want to see Scorsese get weird, this is the film for you. It is definitely one of his films that isn't necessarily given super widespread praise, but I absolutely loved it. I think this will be one of the films of Scorsese's filmography that will be one of the most revisitable and rewatchable movies because it has such a charm to it. But at the same time, our main character is super unlikable. You kind of don't even feel sympathy for him at a certain point because of how often he fails just over and over again. And you kind of feel like the same way he is, just getting tired because you're up all night. And it's just so wacky, so weird, and definitely an underrated film in this man's filmography that I think everyone should check out at only 1 hour and a half. The Wolf of Wall Street is another one that is absolutely wild. This is probably the single craziest freaking movie I've ever seen, and I'll be like the millionth white guy to say that it is one of the best films of the 2010s easily. This is my favorite Leonardo DiCaprio performance. The plot is absolutely wacky and wild. It felt like I was on the same drugs that these people were on the entire movie because I was freaking tripping out. This was crazy, and I just could not stop watching this film even though it was extremely long. The King of Comedy is really an incredible movie. Robert De Niro gave an incredible performance, potentially one of my favorites of all time. Obviously, you got Scorsese's style and direction, which is always pretty amazing, even in his weaker films. What I found most impressive about this film, though, is the way that it deals with its themes, especially being as relevant as they are in today's society. Specifically the themes of validation and mental health, which are tackled incredibly well in this film. I would argue this was one that aged one of, if not the best of his entire filmography, even given its insane subject matter. It doesn't feel pretentious whatsoever. Rupert Pupkin is extremely human and relatable, while at the same time feeling not relatable and extremely stubborn. I really have no words. This film made me feel something that I don't think I've felt in a film before. Also, similar to Taxi Driver, it gives a purposely ambiguous ending, which can be interpreted in many ways, which I thought was genius. Anyways, I think this was an incredible experience and really a film that is extremely relevant today with its themes of mental health and all that sort of stuff. And overall, if you loved Joker, this is a film that really heavily inspired Joker, and I highly recommend everyone check this one out. I keep telling myself that I don't like religious films for some reason, but I assume it's because all of these previous cheesy religious films that I've seen are just portraying religion in such a weird way. Films that I've stumbled upon recently though, such as this and The Seventh Seal, are some of the most honest, thought-provoking films I've ever seen and some of my favorites of all time now. Silence is an incredibly real look at faith. There is no such thing as religious objectivity, but this is probably the closest that I've seen to it. I myself am still very young, and although I haven't necessarily figured out religion and where I stand, I was brought up in a Christian household, so this film really resonated even deeper than it would have maybe for some others. This film was absolutely beautiful and brutal at the same time. Absolutely stunning cinematography, easily Scorsese's best looking film, not necessarily from a camera work perspective, but everything in this film, I could see it. I could feel the mud, the mist, the grass, and the pain and anguish of Andrew Garfield's character. I felt everything that he was going through mentally and physically. Nobody except Andrew Garfield could have played this character. Perfect casting and a perfect performance. The tone of the film was absolutely impeccable, and I fell in love with it for within the first 10 minutes. No score, just silence. No pun intended. Absolutely hypnotizing and gives the film a more realistic feel, which it absolutely benefits from. It was extremely quiet and patient, which is the tone that I absolutely love in films if done correctly, which this absolutely was. The film was 2 hours and 40 minutes long. It felt more like 5 hours, but I was so enthralled in the film that it was absolutely not a problem. In fact, I think it was a good thing. The prolonged anxiety and anguish that you feel during this film makes you resonate more with every character and feel like there's time to flesh out every little detail and to see both sides of the story. As I said, this film comes as close to religious objectivity as you can in my opinion, and you're meant to see Christianity as the quote-unquote good guys in the beginning, but as you go on in the film, especially once Ferreira is introduced, you start to see the other side of the spectrum. Absolutely incredible film that made me feel so much and was so insanely draining, and I absolutely loved it. The Irishman was a film that surprised me immensely. This was maybe the film that I was looking forward to the least because its 3.5-hour runtime was extremely intimidating. But this might just be my favorite film of 2019, and that is saying something. If it's not my favorite, it is definitely up there, but if you know me, you know that long movies scare me, and this was really special though. Performances were absolutely gosh dang amazing. I mean, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Al Pacino, come on. They all gave outstanding performances and were written just so well. All of their characters had plenty of time to be fleshed out with their own nuances and flaws while having likable and admirable traits at the exact same time. This film really felt like a deeply personal, intimate film that seems like Scorsese's passion project. 3.5 hours and not one scene in this entire movie is unimportant in any way. I was absolutely blown away by this film, maybe my favorite of 2019 now, and yeah, it's just absolutely incredible. One of the most immersive experiences I've had in a film in a very long time. 3.5 hours, and I did not want to take a break watching this movie. Everything felt really great. Everything had the emotion when it needed to, and it really hit hard, and overall it is just such an incredible experience that I will not forget for a very long time. So that is it for my Martin Scorsese ranking. You will definitely disagree with my list because I have a pretty controversial one, so let me know what Scorsese films you've seen and rank them in the comments below, and also If you liked the video, definitely leave a like and subscribe to my channel with post notifications on so you're the first to know every time I upload a video just like this one. But that's it for this video, guys, and I will see you in the next one.